My father did not yell at me. He did not argue with me. He called my boss and tried to end my career instead. But what he did not expect was that HR would call him back and document everything. My name is Daniel. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior operations analyst. I always believed that if you work hard, stay disciplined, and mind your own business, your career will be safe. I was wrong. Because sometimes the biggest threat to your stability is not a competitor, not a coworker, but your own family. This is the story of how my father tried to get me fired and how one corporate phone call changed our relationship forever. The day my manager told me that my own father had called the company trying to get me fired was the day I understood that some parents would rather destroy your success than lose control over you. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a senior operations analyst at a national logistics firm, and everything I have in my life came from discipline, overtime, and years of refusing to quit when things felt impossible. I was not born into comfort, and I was not handed connections. I studied at night while working part-time jobs, I saved every bonus instead of spending it, and I slowly built a reputation at work for being reliable, calm, and precise. Growing up, my father believed that authority was absolute, and that children, even adult children, owed loyalty that looked like obedience. I was always the responsible one in the family, the one who followed rules and avoided trouble, while my younger siblings were allowed to test boundaries and still be forgiven. When I moved out at 27 to be closer to my job, my father told relatives that I was selfish and ungrateful. When I received my first promotion, he said companies promote people so they can blame them. Later, when I bought my apartment, he warned me that independence makes people arrogant. So over time, I stopped sharing my achievements because every good moment somehow turned into a lecture about humility and respect. When I got engaged last year, I told him carefully, expecting at least a neutral reaction, but instead he asked whether I planned to quit working after marriage and whether my fiancé would control my decisions. I calmly explained that my career was important to me and that marriage would not change my work ethic. That conversation ended in tension, but I thought it would pass. Before I continue, I always wonder where people are listening from when they hear stories like this. So, wherever you are right now, I am honestly curious what country you're in or what time it is there, because when this happened to me, it felt like time slowed down in my world while everything else kept moving normally. The morning everything shifted began like any other. I was reviewing quarterly projections and preparing slides for a client presentation when my manager, Claire, messaged me asking if I could step into her office. Her tone was neutral but serious, and as soon as I sat down, she closed the door and asked if everything was all right at home. That question alone made my chest tighten. Then she said that earlier that morning, a man claiming to be my father had called the company main line and insisted on speaking with someone in leadership. He told her that I was dishonest, unstable, and unfit for my position, and that he believed I had manipulated financial data in recent reports. Hearing those words felt unreal, almost like she was describing another employee. I asked her if she believed him, and she said absolutely not, but company policy required documenting any external accusation, especially one involving financial misconduct, because such claims cannot simply be ignored. My hands stayed steady, but inside something heavy settled in my chest, because I understood immediately that this was not an emotional outburst. This was deliberate. My father had listened carefully whenever I mentioned work projects during family dinners. He had stored details about deadlines, software upgrades, and budget reviews, and now he was using that information to sound credible. I assured Claire that every report I handled went through multiple approval layers and that I had full documentation to support my work. She nodded and said she trusted my professionalism, but HR would need to meet with me to formally close the complaint. As I walked back to my desk, I realized that my father had crossed a line that could not be dismissed as family tension. He had stepped into my professional world with the intention of shaking it. And for the first time, I felt not just hurt, but alert. Because when someone moves from criticism to active interference, the situation becomes something entirely different. And I knew in that moment that I would have to handle this carefully, not emotionally, but strategically, if I wanted to protect everything I had built. The HR meeting was scheduled for that same afternoon, and even though I knew I had done nothing wrong, my body still reacted with tension, because when accusations involve finances and integrity, the damage can spread quietly, even after the truth is proven. I walked into the conference room with my laptop and a folder containing performance reports, budget summaries, and approval emails from the last 6 months, because if there was one thing I had learned in corporate life, it was that documentation protects you more than emotion ever can. The HR director and a compliance officer were seated across from me, and their expressions were neutral, professional, and careful. They explained that the caller had confidently identified himself as my father, provided my full name, date of birth, and even referenced the distribution optimization project I was currently leading, which meant he had paid attention to details I casually shared during family conversations. That realization made me feel exposed in a way I had never experienced before, because it meant normal, private discussions had been quietly collected and repurposed. They asked whether there had been recent disputes at home that might explain such a call, and I paused before answering because reducing years of control, criticism, and subtle manipulation into a simple explanation felt almost impossible. I finally said that my father struggles with my independence and sometimes reacts strongly when he feels excluded from major decisions. HR nodded and clarified that while companies cannot control family conflict, they must take all financial misconduct claims seriously. They then asked me to walk them through the reports mentioned in the complaint. I opened my laptop and calmly showed them time-stamped submissions, internal approval chains, audit trails, and digital signatures from senior management that clearly demonstrated transparency. As we moved through each document, their posture relaxed, and within minutes, they confirmed there were no discrepancies, no irregularities, and no cause for concern. One of them even commented that my documentation was unusually thorough, which gave me a small sense of relief. But what stayed with me more than anything was the fact that my father had chosen to escalate beyond emotional criticism into formal, professional interference. And once someone takes that step, the relationship changes permanently. After the meeting, HR informed me that they would document the call as an unfounded external allegation, but that if further contact occurred, they might need to respond directly because repeated interference could qualify as harassment. I thanked them for their professionalism and returned to my desk, but my focus was no longer on spreadsheets. It was on understanding intention. This was not about correcting a mistake. This was about control. For years, my father had expressed disappointment that I made decisions without consulting him. When I chose my apartment, he criticized the location. When I selected my engagement venue, he questioned the cost. When I accepted new responsibilities at work, he warned that I was becoming overly ambitious. Every achievement seemed to threaten him rather than make him proud, and I had spent years minimizing his comments, telling myself he was from a different generation, that he simply expressed concern poorly. But sitting there, replaying the HR conversation, I realized I had been translating control into care because it was easier than confronting the truth. That evening, I drove to my parents' house, not to argue, but to confirm something. When my father opened the door, his expression was calm, almost confident, as if he expected gratitude rather than confrontation. I asked him directly whether he had called my employer, and he admitted it without hesitation, saying that a responsible father has a duty to warn others if his child is making reckless decisions. I felt anger rising, but I kept my tone measured and told him that accusing someone of financial misconduct is serious and that the company had documented everything. The word documented made him pause because documentation limits narrative control. He tried to downplay the situation, saying he only wanted to protect me from stress and failure, but his earlier statements to my manager told a different story. I then said clearly that any further contact with my workplace would be considered interference and could carry legal consequences. He laughed lightly, as if corporate systems were exaggerated threats, but I noticed something shift in his posture, because this time I was not debating or defending, I was stating a boundary. And when I left his house that night, I understood that this situation was no longer about convincing him to respect me. It was about ensuring that he could not damage what I had built. And that required strategy, consistency, and evidence rather than emotion or hope. For a few days after that conversation, there was silence. And I almost allowed myself to believe that maybe the warning had worked. Maybe the documentation had discouraged him. And maybe the situation would quietly fade the way smaller conflicts had in the past. But I underestimated how deeply control was tied to his identity. Because the following week, HR emailed me again, asking if I could come by for a quick update. And the moment I read that message, I felt a calm certainty rather than panic, because part of me had expected this. They told me that the same number had contacted the company again, this time asking whether an internal audit had been opened regarding my recent projects, and whether leadership had begun reviewing my access permissions. That detail confirmed something important. This was no longer a single impulsive action. This was monitoring. He wanted to know whether his attempt had created damage. HR explained that while the first call had been documented as an unfounded allegation, repeated contact could shift the situation into harassment territory, and they asked whether I would consent to them returning the call formally to clarify company policy and warn against further interference. I agreed immediately, because silence only feeds persistence, and if boundaries were going to be set, they needed to be set by an authority he could not emotionally manipulate. I signed a written statement confirming that the caller was my father and authorizing the company to address the matter directly, according to compliance protocol. 2 days later, they invited me back to the conference room, not for questioning, but to update me on what had happened when they returned his call. The compliance officer explained that my father initially sounded composed and repeating his concerns about my supposed instability and financial mismanagement. But once they informed him that the conversation was being recorded and that knowingly false allegations involving financial misconduct could constitute defamation, his tone shifted noticeably. He attempted to reframe his statements as parental concern, claiming he only wanted to ensure his daughter was not overwhelmed. But the officer calmly clarified that requesting termination without evidence and implying criminal behavior was inappropriate and potentially actionable. They further informed him that any additional contact with the company without formal legal representation would be documented and reviewed for escalation. Hearing this, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not revenge, but validation. Because for the first time, an external structure had drawn a firm boundary that did not depend on my emotional strength. HR assured me that my employment record remained strong and that leadership had full confidence in my performance. They also advised me to document any further direct communication from him that referenced my workplace. That evening, my phone lit up repeatedly with incoming calls from my father, but I did not answer. Instead, I let each call ring out and took screenshots of the call log, preserving timestamps as evidence. Eventually, a message arrived, accusing me of embarrassing him by involving outsiders and claiming that I had exaggerated his intentions. The wording was familiar, shifting blame, reframing accountability as betrayal. I responded once, calmly, stating that my professional life was separate from family dynamics and that any further interference would be handled formally. I did not argue, I did not explain, I did not defend. because I understood now that explanation invites debate, and debate invites control. After sending that message, I placed my phone face down and felt a long, unfamiliar silence settle around me. It was not peaceful yet, but it was clear. The dynamic had shifted from emotional pressure to documented accountability, and that shift changed something inside me as well. I was no longer reacting to his actions. I was anticipating them, preparing for them, and neutralizing them methodically. The fear that once accompanied his authority had been replaced by a structured response, and in that structure, I found a kind of strength that did not rely on approval or reconciliation. It relied on evidence, process, and calm consistency. And for the first time since the initial phone call, I felt that my career, my reputation, and my future were no longer vulnerable to private family conflicts because they were protected by something stronger than personal negotiation. They were protected by boundaries backed by systems that could not be intimidated or persuaded by emotional narratives. And that realization marked the true turning point, not just in the situation, but in how I viewed my own independence. In the weeks that followed, the tension that had hovered over my work life slowly began to dissolve. HR formally closed the file, labeling the complaint as unfounded external interference, and documented that the matter had been addressed directly with the caller. My manager reassured me once again that my performance reviews remained strong and that leadership had full confidence in my integrity. Hearing those words meant more than I expected, because while I had trusted my work, I also understood how fragile reputation can be in professional environments. Even a whisper of misconduct can follow someone for years. But transparency, documentation, and calm responses had protected me, and that realization gave me a deeper sense of stability than any promotion ever had. My father did not contact the company again. The warnings from HR had done what emotional conversations never could. They had introduced consequences, and consequences speak a language that control cannot easily override. He did attempt to call me several times during the following month, but the tone of his messages had changed. There was less authority and more frustration, less certainty and more defensiveness. He accused me of choosing my employer over my family and of humiliating him by allowing outsiders to challenge his intentions. But I no longer felt compelled to argue because I finally understood something clearly. Love does not require surrender, and respect does not mean allowing someone to damage your future. I responded briefly, stating that my career was not open for discussion and that boundaries were necessary for our relationship to continue in any healthy form. After that, communication between us became limited and neutral. Family gatherings grew quieter, conversations shorter, and topics safer. And although part of me felt a quiet sadness over the distance, another part felt lighter because the constant pressure to defend my independence had lifted. Months later, during my annual performance review, my manager informed me that I was being promoted to lead analyst, a role that involved mentoring junior staff and overseeing larger strategic projects. When I signed the updated contract, I felt something deeper than professional pride. I felt ownership, not just of my position, but of my life, because it had been tested under pressure and survived the situation. My father had forced me to shift from emotional tolerance to strategic protection, and that shift changed how I approached not only family dynamics, but every relationship in my life. I began prioritizing clarity over comfort, documentation over assumption, and boundaries over guilt. My engagement grew stronger because my partner saw firsthand how I handled crisis with calm reasoning rather than reaction. And at work, colleagues trusted me even more because I remained composed during personal stress. Sometimes I reflect on how easily I could have minimized the first phone call, telling myself it was just concern expressed poorly. but small, unchecked interference can grow into significant damage if ignored. Addressing it early with evidence and structure prevented escalation and taught me that protecting your future sometimes requires standing firm against the very people who raised you. If you are listening to this story right now, I genuinely want to know where you are watching from and what time it is there, because situations like this unfold quietly in many homes, and people rarely speak about them openly. And I also want to ask you, what would you have done if your own parent tried to interfere with your livelihood? Would you have stayed silent to preserve temporary peace, or would you have documented everything and allowed accountability to step in? For me, the lesson became simple yet powerful. Independence is not rebellion, boundaries are not disrespect, and protecting your professional identity is not betrayal. Sometimes the most responsible thing an adult can do is draw a clear line and defend it, calmly, consistently, and without apology. Because once you establish that boundary, the stability that follows is stronger than any approval you once chased. And that stability becomes the foundation on which the rest of your life can finally stand without fear. After everything that happened, I learned one thing very clearly. Boundaries are not disrespect. They are protection. If you listen to the story till the end, I really want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it in your country right now? And tell me honestly, if your own parent tried to sabotage your career, would you stay silent or would you do what I did?